afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first session of the Radical Thinker Conference series. So my name is Nicolas Chevrolier. I'm an associate professor at Nairobi Business University in the field of sustainability, and I'm here with my co-host, Ronald Jersen, who is professor in business ethics. So the Radical Conference series gives a voice to alternative perspective at the intersection of business, society, and ecology. And why? Because we want to go back to the root of things. Radical is radix in Greek. So we want to go back to what makes actually those streams of thoughts alive in the past and now. So we will do this every quarter, and today we welcome Timothée Parrique for the first conference. So welcome, Timothée. Timothée actually just graduated. He got his PhD actually entitled The Political Economy of Degrowth last year. It's 800 pages actually of deep analysis of what degrowth is. So today the topic, the radical thinking, will be over degrowth. The session of today actually will be split in two parts. First, Timothée will present some elements of degrowth. So please be curious. If you have any questions, you can post them in the chat, and we will actually pass them on to Timothée. And in the next 30 minutes of this session, we will actually interact with Timothée with questions. So Timothée, with no further ado, the floor is yours.
So now, hello everyone. I think you should see me and the slides. Do you confirm?
It's perfect.
Great. So let me start with my first sentence, which I've thought a lot about. Here it goes. The spectre is hunting Europe. The spectre of degrowth. And and degrowth is indeed everywhere these days. In the news, you find articles about the need for, our obsession with economic growth, the need for shrinking the economy and give up economic growth, different calls for prosperity without growth, for just going beyond growth, for degrowth and post-growth. You also have a rising numbers of organizations that have embraced that strange term, degrowth. They're taking the snail as a symbol of slowness and smallness, and we'll soon see what that means. And here you can find social movements, political parties, research networks, media outlets. They all write about how problematic economic growth is and why degrowth is necessary and desirable. The term itself, degrowth, was born in France in 2002 in this small magazine. First only really as a slogan, as a critique of sustainable development. So the authors of one article just, called it, we should not have sustainable development, we should call it décroissance durable, sustainable degrowth, because they were pointing at how the ecological crisis was really a matter of targeting countries and classes that were responsible for the bulk of the emissions. So it started like this, and the term has been traveling into French-speaking regions in Quebec, in Belgium, and French-speaking Switzerland, but also very quickly in Spain as decrescimento, in Italy, discrescita, in Germany, postwachstum, and in the English-speaking world as degrowth. But of course, if the term emerged in 2002, that specific concept of degrowth, it has built on ideas that has been there for a very long time, and especially since the end of the 60s. I mean, here we find a melting pot of subversive critiques of capitalism, productivism, economic growth. The bioeconomics of Nicolas Georgescu-Roegen and the work of Herman Daly, for example, are two founding fathers of the School of Ecological Economics. You may know the Limits to Growth report, but also the criticism of GDP and national accounting by Marilyn Waring, the work of Ivan Illich on technological thresholds, criticism of patriarchy by Maria Mies, and the rise of ecofeminism by Françoise de Bonne. Murray Bookchin and his libertarian municipalism, The Small is Beautiful of Ernest Friedrich Schumacher, the critical analysis of consumerism and workism of Juliet Schor, the American sociologist, and many more. But what was new in 2002 is that all these critical ideas that had been just laying around a bit everywhere converged into one single concept, degrowth. And what was once just a slogan has now become a whole field of academic research. So there are now around 500 peer-reviewed articles published on the topic and a number of books, some of them bestsellers. I'm sure you've heard about Tim Jackson, Prosperity Without Growth from 2009. There's the Degrowth Dictionary from 2014, and more recently, Less is More by Jason Hickel from last year. You also have like research centers now that start to specialize on degrowth studies, and I found more than 100 master's and PhD theses written on the topic. So this is what's happening, but by now, I'm sure you have the question in your head. You want to know, what is degrowth? So this is the question I want to explore today in this 30 minutes, and we'll go straight to it. It starts with the definition. Degrowth is the planned and democratic reduction of production and consumption in rich countries to reduce environmental pressures and inequalities while improving well-being. Okay, I like this definition. That's the one I use because I think it stresses the fact that degrowth as a concept has four distinctive features. Four distinctive features having to do with environmental sustainability, social justice, economic well-being, and radical democracy. So let's get into one of them. The first one, environmental sustainability. So here you see a picture from a recent study using the donut of Kate Raworth, where you can see the planetary boundaries. So these planetary boundaries that have been defined at the end of the 2000s by scientists in Sweden, showing that these represent the limits to not overshoot in order to remain in a safe space for humanity, this little green corridor under the ecological ceiling. So today, when you look at the situation in high-income economies, like here, the numbers for France, what do you see? You see that these economies are overshooting planetary boundaries. So that means, in terms of ecological economics, we like to compare economies to metabolism. So in the same way, we talk of an economic metabolism. An economy is a bit of a super organism that needs to extract resources and energy from the environment, does something with it, and then expulse it back. What we see when I see these figures, it tells me that we have economies that are just too big for the resources that are out there, and especially for the assimilative capacities of ecosystems. For example, the climate and its capacity to absorb greenhouse gases without warming up and disrupting other ecosystems. So here we got ourselves a bunch of fat economies, obese economies that just do not fit sustainably with their environment. Starting with this, you have two solutions. Either people will tell you that you can reduce throughput, so reduce the metabolism, the use of energy and material of these economies while still growing GDP. That's the notion of green growth. So if we green economic growth, if we decouple, that's a technical term, we decouple GDP growth from environmental pressures, then it's fine. We can grow forever without deteriorating the environment. The problem is that this is not happening. This has never happened, actually. Many often when you hear studies saying we've been managing to decouple, we've reached some kind of degrowth, it only looks at CO2 emissions, which is not much. Then these are very often temporary studies. And even in the best case of decoupling, we have a handful of countries less than 20 that have managed to actually keep growing their economies while reducing, not all of them, but just one, just CO2 emissions, we see that the cuts are just very, very tiny, way too tiny compared to what scientists tell us we need to reduce emissions. So here, degrowth starts from a premise that if we cannot green growth, or at least if we cannot green it as fast as we want, then the other solution is to reduce production and consumption directly. And that is the first distinctive feature of degrowth, this macroeconomic diet, making an economy smaller. And some people say that, oh, degrowth, the name, we don't like it, and we'll get back to this, I'm sure, but at least it's descriptive. When you see these curves coming, for example, from UNEP emissions gap, we are in the black or in the yellow curve up. We need to be in the green path. What's the difference between the two? If you had to describe them in one word, what would you say? Would you call that sustainable development? No, that we need to degrow, we need to decrease, we need to descend. That's what we need to do now. And that was the first feature. Let's switch to the second one, having to do with social justice. So here it's a criticism, let's say, of the discourse of the Anthropocene. You've heard the term Anthropocene, and it suggests that somehow unsustainability today is a species problem. We're all on the same boat. It has to do with humanity as a whole. We're pushing against planetary boundaries. But this is not the case. The richest 10% in the world accounted for half of total emissions growth between 1990 and 2015. Half of these emissions. If you take the poorest 50% on the planet, they did not increase their emissions between 1990 and 2015. And these trends are just continuing. This is the latest report from Oxfam showing actually the continuation of these trends by 2030. What is that telling us? It's telling us that actually solving environmental crisis is a matter of focusing on where emissions are. And emissions are in high-income countries, and more specifically in high-income classes. Some of them living in the global south, but most of them living in the global north. That's the left side of the curve. So when we speak about degrowth, this is not, degrowing of everyone and everything and all the time. This is targeting levels of extreme wealth that gives a purchasing power that enable unsustainable lifestyles. You've seen this figure probably. It's another way of showing actually the disparity in terms of sustainable metabolism of different economies in the world. Economies like Qatar and Luxembourg and Canada and the United States that, by February and March of the year, they've already spent everything they could sustainably use in terms of natural resources in a year. So they're already in situation of overshoot. On the other hand, you take Ecuador, Cuba, Colombia, Indonesia, these are just the closest that we've been from ecological sustainability. Again, this shows that we're living in an unequal world. And so therefore, we need to ask ourselves the question of, who needs to do what? And today, the situation is we have a finite planet, and high-income countries and high-income classes are monopolizing a huge part of planetary resources. So I think, and that is one of the starting and distinctive feature of degrowth, we should add one more sustainable development goals, SDG number 0. That would be eradicate extreme wealth. Then you can get one stone, two birds. You can actually decrease inequality, and doing so decrease environmental pressures. That's one's the second feature. Let's switch to the third one, which I've called economic well-being, even though it's a bit broader than this. So the idea here is that economic growth is not correlated to well-being in most high-income countries. It was in their history at the beginning, when you get a bit more money, when you're in a situation of need, that translates into increased levels of well-being. But after a certain threshold of GDP per capita, the links disappear. The link between Happiness and GDP disappears, but also the link between education and GDP, health standards and GDP, all measures of quality of life and political participation and conviviality and trust and GDP, all of that disappears, which tells us that actually in high-income country, economic growth is not a valid, legitimate objective to maximize well-being, which an economy should be centered around well-being. At least that's what I assume. So here you can see in these numbers from the latest World Happiness Report that only a small part, the blue, the dark blue on the left, only the small part of happiness in this 21st happiest countries in the world is explained by GDP per capita. The rest is just unrelated. So when you see that a country like Iceland or New Zealand or Finland or all these countries just beat, or even Costa Rica beat the UK and the United States, whereas the GDP is just a fraction of the one of the US, we can ask ourselves the question of actually economic growth being unnecessary for well-being in these countries. The deeper reason behind this, and that structures the idea of degrowth, is that an economy should be organized around need satisfaction. And needs are finite. They follow threshold of satisfaction. When you're unhealthy, when you're sick, you need access to medicine, a doctor, a good hospital, all of that. But once you've had this, you're good. Same thing, if I do not have a bike, well, I need one bike, not a 2% growth in the bike industry forever. So here we see the idea of economic growth, treating economic growth as a temporary phenomenon. So in moments of fluctuation, for example, the pandemic, where we need to produce something new, like mask, then we do so. But once that need is fulfilled and we don't need it, then the economy, can slow down. So we should see our economies expanding in times of need and, shrinking in other times. But today we're not in that mentality. We're in the mentality where economy should be shrinking all the time, like a mad balloon, just ready to explode the earth. I think it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because GDP as an indicator doesn't make the difference between desirable and undesirable activities, doesn't include natural elements, doesn't include social elements, does not include inequality. It does not include or include very badly the qualitative aspect of the goods and services it measures. GDP is an old indicator created in the United States 100 years ago. And now we've just developed this manic, monomanic obsession with just increasing GDP, even sometimes that comes at the cost of just destroying the planet or legitimating very high level of inequality and exploitation. So that was the third feature of shunning away from GDP and recentering the economy on need satisfaction. Last feature. So in the definition, remember, it's not a reduction of production and consumption. It's a planned and democratic reduction of production and consumption. So why is that? Let's say you could say it's historically degrowth has always been part of, has got this strong anarchist roots tying down to concept like the libertarian municipalism of Murray Bookchin. This idea that to be sustainable and just, an economy should be democratically managed. And by democratically managed, that can mean many things. In the degrowth literature, example includes organizing businesses, as self-managed cooperatives, or having citizen audits for important issues like the introduction of new technologies or the analysis of debt in time of debt cancellation. Referendums, citizen convention like the one we had in France last year about mitigating climate change, participatory municipal budget, consumer groups. The idea here is to build an economic democracy. And why is that so important? Well, because for all the first three features, sustainability, justice, and well-being, you cannot make technical decisions about how to split a carbon budget or how high you should put a tax on wealth, or what should be the difference between essential goods and non-essential goods. All of these decisions are inherently political. problem, today in a GDP-obsessed economy, we tend to decentralize this decision-making to market mechanisms. So companies decide what to produce based on the price of this product. Governments just focus on boosting GDP regardless of what it does. Consumers just focus on their purchasing power because they need the income to satisfy their needs. So the idea here is to deconstruct this hegemony of economic governance in order to be able to re-put the economy as just one small part of society itself, one small part of nature. And when we consider these four features together, and especially the last one, we realize the difference between degrowth and a recession. So a recession is when you have negative economic growth. Degrowth, as I've defined it, is a paradigm for sustainability transformation. So it's enormously broader than a recession. So Japan and its 20 years of secular stagnation is not an example of degrowth. The recession in Venezuela is not an example of degrowth, and nor is the lockdown or the pandemic, because if it's just an event, accidental event occurring from outside, being suffered by society, it's not degrowth. Degrowth is a societal project, like sustainable development or communism. It's a society that decides to organize itself around, to resize its economy for social and ecological justice. So this is what degrowth is about, but there's much more in the concept that you can see in the definition. Because over the years, since it has existed in the beginning of the 2000s, the field has grown and it has just appropriated some concept that already existed. You can see the bioeconomy that existed in the 70s, ecofeminism as well, the transition town movement, steady state economy in the US, the idea of the perma-circular economy, the post-development, which was also going strong in the 80s and 90s, the idea of radical democracy. So all of these concepts now find themselves within this degrowth sphere. But perhaps to capture the essence of the idea of degrowth and to not narrow it down too much, we need to remember that degrowth is both a critique of the hegemony of capitalism and economic growth. That's the biting side of the concept, but also an alternative way of envisioning life in a post-growth future. This is why people now call it post-growth. Post-growth and degrowth, these two ideas are extremely similar. It's just a different way of approaching it. The idea of post-growth, imagining prosperity without or beyond economic growth, in the same way that we talk of post-capitalism when we want to imagine what will come after capitalism. And in order to have this transition, the degrowth scholarship and degrowth activists have proposed a number of proposals, which I've counted in my thesis. I've put you there a few of the most popular. Caps on resource use. Today, the mainstream mentality, this economic mentality, is to put taxes on resources. You put a tax on carbon, and then you hope somehow that through market mechanism, consumers will buy less carbon-intensive product and producers will produce less carbon-intensive product. You don't know. You hope that it will. Well, degrowth takes a different approach, imposing like an overall cap. There's been a few systems proposed that does that. I'm thinking here of the tradable energy quotas text designed by David Fleming in the UK, where basically you put a cap of carbon emissions in one country, and then you have the introduction of individual carbon cards, and then you have these carbon quotas circulating alongside euros or whatever your currency when you're buying fossil energy. That's just one example. Another example is universal basic services. A proposal came out also from the UK in 2017. In the follow-up of discussions about universal basic income, which is basic to say basic income is good. You give money to people like this, but in a capitalist economy, that money is going to just come back to capital very quickly. What about we do universal basic services instead? So we guarantee the gratuity, the freeness of a few basic services like housing, local transport, healthcare, education, judicial services, to make sure that people do not fall into the purchasing power race, so that you can actually increase living power without necessarily increasing purchasing power. Just an example of a policy. So by now you should have understood that degrowth is a very controversial idea, and actually not everyone is talking about it positively. Most of it is quite a bashing of the idea. Here's one chapter of my thesis where I've counted misconception of the concept on top and valid criticism of the concept, which also has limits. And but here I just want to have a little reflection to say that it's a good thing that it's controversial. If it's controversial, it means that it's revamping, bringing back some energy into some old discussions, nothing new, but environmental justice, globalization, North-South relation, the division of labor, distribution of value during production. Those are, fundamental questions of political economy. But every time a concept comes in, let it be sustainable development, eco-socialism, collapsology, degrowth, then we reframe, we take back these questions from a different angle. So now the question today is around degrowth, and I think that's an interesting discussion. I also find the bashing quite weird. The criticisms I understand and the controversy I embrace, but the stubbornness of the misconceptions, people being like, oh, degrowth is an advocacy of recession, it's stupid, you should not advocate for recession, it's bad. Which was perhaps okay 20 years ago when no one knew but the concept, but now it's hardly impossible not to stumble upon a valid description of degrowth when you type the term online. So it's strange. So maybe it tells us something about a collective failure of imagination. There's this image I made because I was getting sick of people like, oh, you're for degrowth, so therefore you're a communist. And well, I was trying to explain that this dichotomy between capitalism and communism is very dry and uninteresting. It is the black and white of Cold War political economy discussion. What we need now is a palette of colors. We need to have different futures. Degrowth is one of these, we could say, post-capitalist concept, but there are just plenty more on all sides of the border. So today it's not a matter of choosing the silver bullet concept that will save us all. It's a matter of actually enriching our analytical toolbox to be able to just liberate the future from this there is no alternative, the end of history doxa. And so now maybe I can answer the question that I actually posed in the opening slide, which said degrowth is a radical idea, question mark. And to answer this, okay, I'm going to start by this. Imagine an extraterrestrial sociologist coming to Earth now and observing us. And this reminds me of this passage from Ursula Le Guin of The Dispossessed, a dystopian novel. Let you a bit of time to read it. The key thing in this quote is, this shocking feeling of you come to Earth and you realize that, we've organized society around the maximization of an abstract indicator designed by a bunch of dudes in the US at the beginning of the 20th century. An indicator that is purely quantitative, doesn't include nature or anything non-monetary, doesn't include all the things we actually care the most, love, family, intellectual pursuit, science. It's not this, it just counts money. And somehow we've designed an entire society around this money. And even in a moment where the Earth, the actual planet that supports life, the life of our species, is just crumbling down into fires and floods, we're still chatting, how can we just avoid the ecological crisis without, slowing down GDP? That's the problem. So I think sociologists from outer Earth, or actually any sociologist from Earth, will look at economists and the mad system they have built as utter nonsense. So within that system that says increasing GDP, increasing profits, increasing income, is the overarching priority of our species. Degrowth is indeed impossible and very radical. But that tells us something. It tells us something about the entire system and the mentality that surrounds it. It tells us how inadapted that system is to the reality of the Anthropocene. And so it makes us aware, and this is why degrowth has often been characterized as a missile word, because it just comes and just breaks down this ideology of growth, this conflation of economic growth, abstract increase in GDP, with progress, almost with the direction of history, with low GDP countries being the past, pre-modernity, and high GDP countries being the future, the very definition of civilization. So I think we should reverse the burden of proof. This is a paragraph from the conclusion of my thesis, where I've titled the conclusion a realistic demand for the impossible. It is realistic because actually I think the burden of proof should shift, because it is economic growth that is biophysically impossible. At least that's what we know from all scientific data is available. So being degrowth from that sense is more realistic than its competition. But then making this realistic demand for the impossible makes us aware that today we should strive for impossible goals, because impossible goals, they educate our desires for overcoming the limitedness of that narrow capitalist system we have built today. And I think degrowth is doing part of this. And I think this is what one of the tasks of social scientists and scientists overall today is to somehow deconstruct this narrow-mindedness of economics in order to allow, to fix not only this crisis of imagination, but also to be able to build just and more sustainable futures. So that's 30 minutes. I'll stop here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Timothée. It's perfect. And you see also on the slides a few pointers from Timothée as well. What I would propose, we can take one questions from the chat.
Yep.
And then we can move on to the questions. Don't hesitate to post your question on the chat. It will come as we go. Ronald, would you want to start with the first question?
Yeah, I'd love to start with the question that Ilona brought up. I think it's very apt because, Parrique, you're a guest here of a business school. And in the business school, we think business-wise, and there was a nice business-wise question that came in. I don't know if you can read the chat, but I can read it aloud. How can you combine degrowth and business resilience while increasing profit? Are there specific focus areas to look into what can make degrowth work in an existing business? And I would like to emphasize the latter one. So suppose that I'm a business, I have become convinced by your story, fascinated, and I'm asking my board of directors, what can we do to promote degrowth as a company?
I mean, I would like to just, answer by posing another question. Why should you increase profits in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And that seems to be like a bit of a strange goal of a business overall. I mean, if we think about what a business is, it's a way of organizing production, which somehow should satisfy the need of someone. Here I'm being, an economic anthropologist. The economy, by definition, is the collective organization of need satisfaction. We come together and ally our forces because that allow us to be more efficient in satisfying our needs. It means we can satisfy needs we cannot satisfy alone, and we can satisfy needs more efficiently together than we could do alone. But at some point, in early history, with the advance of capitalism, and especially with modern capitalism, the private enterprise, we've lost track of that goal, and businesses have been structured legally and structurally and sociologically around that very abstract objective of maximizing abstract value, which is the one of profit. So now, this is a way of answering the question. I'm like, if you identify the needs of the people you serve in your business, and you can satisfy these needs in a way that, make them happy, make you happy, and do not destroy the planet, without necessarily, becoming bigger and bigger, without necessarily, having increasing rates of profit, then why should you want to just strive for more profits? You could surely, cut some workers and maybe go against some environmental regulation and boost your financial result. But would that really improve the quality of your business? I think you would impoverish yourself and society in doing so. So now I think we need, and you know these better than me, this new, triple accounting framework where we look at social value and ecological value in parallel to financial values, and sometimes realize that some businesses, what they call profit, macroeconomically is not profit, it's just the transformation of social ecological value into financial value. And not only transformation, but that means degradation, sometimes irreversibly. If you take, the Amazon rainforest and just cut it to grow beef, you're going to make a lot of money, but we will have lost even more money if we look at the values of ecosystem services that will be lost in cutting the forest. But also then we see that these profits get appropriated by individuals. So you would have done so also widening inequality, which we know is just bad for overall collective welfare. So here, that's my answer to you. Why should you increase profits?
Yeah. Okay. So then the point is, how can you distinguish good sustainability from degrowth? In actual practice, it will be the same, probably.
I mean, I see degrowth in the continuation of the discussion around sustainability. When I was doing the bit of the history, and there was like eco-development, sustainable development, on the sides there was just, eco-socialism, degrowth. I think all of these have tried to approach the same question, how do we satisfy our needs in the way that is just safe and just? That is the question we're all trying to answer. So I won't make a difference between the two. Degrowth has made the analytical choice to start to answer this question by looking at the unsustainability of economic growth. And whereas like other concepts have had a different starting point. But for me, degrowth represents one way of envisioning sustainability.
Let me rebound on the questions of Ronald and Ilya here. You mentioned also, Timothée, at the level of an organization, the goals are important. What about at the level of a society? If we want to imagine degrowth, how would you imagine this at the level of a society even? Can you give us some examples? And also in terms of transition, maybe that's the second part of the question, is where do we start?
I think there are many different possible transitions. When I think about it, it always starts in my mind with a change of indicators. So GDP needs to go. There are now like various alternative indicators of prosperity. The wellbeing budget in New Zealand from 2019 replaced GDP by 65 indicators of social ecological well-being, present, future indicators. It's a wonderful framework. There are just many others. As I said, GDP was created in the 1930s. It was just started to be heavily criticized in the 1950s. First alternative was built in the 1970s, and now there's been just more than 50 indicators that are just waiting to replace GDP. So now we need to be serious about this, and not only say that we'll consider, social and ecological indicators in the periphery of GDP, but just accept the fact that GDP doesn't need to be measured anymore, to just let it go. So that'll be just my first very symbolic choice, but that's not enough, because I think once you've done this, you need to trickle down these question of indicators to the level of the company. As I said, with triple accounting, for example, and at the level also of individual consumers. What do we look at when we consume? Carbon scores are a good example. So now we have Nutri-scores. When you buy food, you can see is it healthy A or is it unhealthy E? And we see that people start to get used. When they buy, they look at the price, but they also look at the health score. So now imagine we add a carbon score, which will be added in France in a few years. People develop, consumers, this multiple visions where they buy, they see, the impact on their health, they see the price, they see the impact on the environment. So we want to complexify, again, the economic decisions we make as consumers, as producers, as business owners, and as economic regulators every single time, giving up the monomatic glasses of GDP and getting ourselves into full multicolors with different indicators together.
So it's changing already indicators to raise awareness, at least of the issue and what we can do about it. That would be a start, and the central indicator has to be switched. That's something that you advocate a lot.
But okay, I know. Okay, let me get one step more, because I think the question of indicators, everyone, is consensual. Actually, when people disagree about degrowth, when I get into debate, we always get to, yeah, I agree, GDP is bad, we need to replace it, but that's not the problem. The problem is that now imagine yourself in a car that is just driving full speed towards the wall. So now we're in the car, the three of us now, and we discuss. We're like, okay, well, maybe it was not too good to drive just looking at the speed meter. Maybe we should have looked at direction as well. The GDP is a speed meter. It measures the speed of the economy, not the direction. And so now maybe you're going to tell me like, okay, we need to change indicators in the future. We need to look at direction and everything. And I'm like, okay, but we need to slow down because I don't want to crash into the wall. So that's the situation now. We need to think in two ways. First, we need to, future planning. How do we in the future avoid to make the terrible mistakes we've done in the past? First mission. Second mission, not a choice either or, mission in parallel. Second mission is to do everything we can right now to just prevent and stop ecological collapse. And that comes with more rapid actions. When I was talking about imposing a resource cap, which would be, let's say, the policy-making instrument coming with the mentality of the carbon budget. We are starting to be used to talk about a carbon budget. So now, for every single ecological resource, you have such budget. So let's make an inventory of all budgets we have. Let's have the discussions of who gets what in the same way that we're doing currently within the IPCC and other organizations about climate change. And now let's just have this in law, to be by law in France or whatever your country, this year we have this carbon budget. It cannot be overcome. And then it becomes a practical question. Do we do this with quotas? How do we regulate the price of these quotas? But let's not kid ourselves and have these incremental little taxes and hope somehow that they will change the system. They have not for the last 20 years, and I don't have much hope that they'll do better in the next 10 years we have to avoid the bulk of the climate crisis.
Okay, so in that transition then that you advocate here, is the word degrowth then appropriate? Because we hear also a lot in our surroundings that if you use degrowth, it has a fairly negative connotation. So just as a word itself, is it appropriate to move forward then?
Well, it depends. I oscillate between sometimes using degrowth, sometimes using postgrowth, depending of the crowd, depending of the level of the discussion. When we're discussing with my colleagues, and we've been working on degrowth for years, for us, we're already designing the shape of the future economy after that degrowth transition. So we're talking of postgrowth imaginaries, because we're like given away like capitalism and GDP and all that stuff. So it's not really a matter. But today in the mainstream, it's good to use a bit like the punchy aspect of the word degrowth. You throw it on the table and now you're like, wow, what's going on? I mean, if I'd written a PhD thesis about well-being economies or happy economies or whatever you call it, sustainable economies, I don't think, I don't think I would be here today. You would have not invited me. So the fact that degrowth provokes is a very good opportunity for us to have these discussions that perhaps we've not had before. And then once these discussions are had, as we've seen in history, that concept will just be replaced by another concept and by another concept, and it's not a matter of, making a battle in between schools and retaining concept to say they're the best. It's just a matter of finding the concept that allow us to ask the right question at the right time.
Okay, perfect. Point taken also on the wording itself and the word degrowth that we can keep on using. I think that's a good message as well. We have a couple of a question from the chat, I think.
Yes, we have. We have also a question coming in by Professor Van der Rey. He's one of our professors at Nijrode, and it came through the email. And I think it's an interesting question that may be a bit of just a detail, but I think it's not. It has to do with the word dystopia that you used somewhere in your presentation. Why do you use that term, and what do you mean by it? I mean, we understand what it is, a negative utopia, but what role does the concept play in your thinking? Dystopia.
Of all questions, I am delighted to receive this one, and that's where it's going to get real nerdy. So the concept I've framed my thesis around is the concept of utopia. So I'm using this concept from a German sociologist called Karl Meinheim, and then a French philosopher called Paul Ricoeur. And what these two sociologists and philosophers have created is a framework where they've put together the concept of ideology and utopia. And in my thesis, I've started by saying today we are, I think, this opposition between the ideology of growth and the utopia of degrowth. This dialectic of this common sense, economic growth is good, definition of progress, and this, upsetting word, degrowth, that is standing as a critique of ideology, but also offering an alternative. So this is why I've called it a utopia. So then, dystopia, perhaps I've used it in my presentation. It's not for me an analytical concept I've used in the thesis. Dystopia perhaps as a utopia gone wrong. I think for me, I see this concept like a sociologist, any worldview that is standing, criticizing the ideology is utopian in the sense of, it think of the present from the perspective of a better future. And that is what's powerful for us economists that suffer from a pathological lack of imagination. Utopia, in my thesis in one chapter, I asked myself, I've constructed an economy out of nowhere. Imagine yourself in 1,000 years and you build your economy from here, and how would it work? All of this as a thought experiment. And once you've done this, you can backcast. So come back to the present and ask yourself, how should I behave? What should I do? What should be the policies today in order to get in the direction of that new economy? And this is different from forecasting, what economists are trained to do, which is just to look at present trends and just throw them with models into the future, which is unfortunately limited because you never really escape the structure of the present. So I think utopia and utopian thinking and utopian methods like backcasting is a wonderful tool for us social scientists to escape this crisis of imagination.
I like the crisis of imagination of economists. I think I can definitely relate to that personally. Let's perhaps take another questions from the chat as well, from Pierre. He's asking also a question related to theory. He's asking, can you elaborate from the perspective of game theory and whether that relates also to what you presented in terms of degrowth theory? Is there a link between game theory and what you've presented?
Well, the problem with the degrowth field is that it's rather small and ignored by most economists. So you won't see, there's been a lot, now there's increasingly a lot of study from sociologists and anthropologists, cultural theorists, but economists are still very shy in studying degrowth. So that's why you won't see many application of game theory into the type of into the concept of degrowth. But I'm thinking, for example, of the question of the geopolitics of degrowth. People are often thinking, well, what happens if one country decides to go for degrowth, but other countries decides to keep going for growth? But these countries somehow are still interacting in that big game that is, for example, climate change mitigation. So that's an interesting question to think about the transition in dynamic terms, putting into together power relations and diverging interest. This added to the fact that we live in a divided world, as I've shown with the division between global north and global south. So that's one example of application. Another application would be to direct businesses themselves as actors. When we look at emissions, we see that 100 businesses in the world are responsible for 71% of all emissions. We see also, when you see a country like France, where you have around 4 million businesses, that big businesses only represent, a portion of that. We have around 300, even less, 250, those big corporations. So here, it's a really uneven playing field where these actors are having a lot to lose from a degrowth transition, but a lot of small actors have a lot to win, and somehow they will need systematically to cooperate, because in the market economy, they are just brought into cooperating in terms of, who employed, who produce, who import, who export. So we need to apply this question to better understand the transition, and that is, perhaps here the best moment to make a call. And I see more and more master students contacting me, asking questions to write their thesis about degrowth and to do a PhD, and now there are just increasing numbers of finding. So if you found a clever way of, looking at game theory and degrowth in a way that can solve, these important questions, just now there will be increasing opportunities to do it, and I invite you to do and get in touch and tell me all about it.
Wonderful. I think an interesting question came up from Shardhan Andram. Shardhan Andram is our Nijrode Professor of Business Spirituality. And the question is, isn't degrowth also, or importantly, a matter of change in consciousness, and which you require so that people become aware of the needs for degrowth? And this leads them then to change at more fundamental levels, so at the consciousness level. So is that part of your thinking about degrowth, that it may have to do with awareness and consciousness of people? And what would that then be more specifically?
Yeah, one concept, one of the most popular concepts within the degrowth literature is the decolonization of the imaginary. So the idea of the collective imaginary from French philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis in the 70s. So talking with this idea of we need to decolonize the imaginary from the belief that more is better, than growth is good. So this kind of debunking these false assumptions. So I completely agree about this, but that makes me think about an interesting point that I discovered reading a PhD thesis from my good friend Matthias Schmelzer, a German historian. He wrote his thesis was translated into a book, The Hegemony of Growth. And what he showed is that the goal of maximizing GDP was just completely inexistent before the 1950s. And even when it came out, most politicians, they refused it. They was like, that makes no sense. Why should I want to increase GDP forever? I want full employment, I want financial stability, and I want to be able to finance whatever the government wants to do. And I don't see why exponential, rates of growth of that funky indicator is going to help us do that. So we've seen that the consciousness of growth here at the government level, so what has been called growthmanship, is very recent, just only from the 60s. So I think here it's when we talk about a change of consciousness, we need to be very careful not to fall into the question of human nature. People often ask me, is degrowth going against human nature? I don't think so. Human nature, perhaps defined broadly, is, I would agree to say that we've always been trying to improve our, situation or quality of life, that we've always been trying to solve problems, to innovate out of just, our problems, but that's not growth. Growth is an increase in GDP, which is not a measure of innovation, which is not a measure of quality of life, and which actually in many high-income countries is uncorrelated not only to innovation, but also to quality of life. So I think the conflation today of actually growth and money-making to a feature of human nature shows us the grip of these funky Sims-like assumptions in macroeconomic models of greedy, self-interested individuals that somehow any anthropologist or sociologist would debunk in 1 second, but because of the so-called superiority of economists, today these ideas have become prevalent. So that's what I'm thinking about when I think about consciousness. Okay, perhaps last comment. Power relations. Every time I think about this changing consciousness, it always goes in parallel for me in my head about not everyone's consciousness is equal today in the crisis. I actually don't like to call it a crisis. In my writings, I refer to it as an ecological beating. You have a minority of people that have just, messed up nature. When you look at emissions in excess of 350 ppm, this kind of sustainable threshold of greenhouse gas emissions, 92% of these emissions come from the global north. So somehow we need to change one consciousness urgently, which is this abnormal imperial mode of living that we find not only in the global north, but more specifically in the rich classes of global north that have somehow created a real game of monopoly, Jumanji style, that now we're stuck in it and we have forgotten that it is a game, but it is a game. So if we realize that this is a game, we can get rid of this outdated consciousness, change the rule of the game, and just reshape the economy so that it's better.
Change the rules of the game, actually. It's almost the title of the book of a good friend of us at Nairobi, André Nayov, Changing the Game, which also advocate to change the rules. I would like to ask you one last question, Timothée, here, which is also on the role of individuals in the development of degrowth, but also on the role of business school. We're a business school at Nairobi University. We have also accepted, we are teaching also traditional economic in many ways. How would you see also the role of business schools to, what I like also, I will reuse your word, it's to create a palette of colors. So what is for you one advice to business schools to bring a palette of colors in the setting?
One key word, pluralism. So today, I don't know for business schools because I've been learning and teaching economics only at university, but the way it works in economics department is that you spend 90% of your time teaching and learning about traditional economics, and then you have the things on the side, which is exactly like caring only about GDP and just then looking at biodiversity loss peripherally. We need true pluralism. So it means not only teaching neoclassical economics, but also ecological economics, feminist economics, Austrian economics, Marxian economics, not just as a sideline, like, okay, this is traditional economics, and this is also an alternative stuff you see in a history of economic thought course or in an economic history. No, but as parallel tools in a toolbox. The screwdriver is not more important than the hammer. If you want to be a good mechanic, you need the two of them. Today, we train economists to only use the hammer. So, of course, when they go in the real world and try to fix things, they do a lot of damage. So theoretical pluralism, we bring back the schools of thought, but also we bring other disciplines and realize that somehow if you want to be a good thinker in the modern world, a good social scientist, you need psychology, you need sociology, you need history, you need anthropology, and you need to realize that economics and its derivatives disciplines are only subfields of that broader field of sociology. And I would add to this, of course, a pluralism of methods. So it's good to know math, but I mean, what I remember from my early education, half of it was math. I don't think that we need the math only to understand actually the obscurities of neoclassical models. But many social science, don't use math. So you need also a variety of methods that will make you able to do, for example, the case study of a specific business. You want to understand a problem within a business, and that's not going to fit your model, that's not going to fit your data. Well, perhaps you would go and have interview and ask people what they think, or maybe observation methods, all kind of stuff that sociologists have done pretty much forever, since very longer than economists. So we need to do so. And here I'm going to end up being a bit not harsh, but let's say stimulating. I still don't understand why I ended up, just being an heterodox economist, managing somehow to study ecological economics. I think it had to do with the fact that I managed to escape to go to Sweden to do that. But otherwise, I think I see all my friends from studying economics in the bachelor, they all now, math cracks working for the financial sectors and the banking sector and the advertisement. Every single one of them, does activity that from my macroeconomic perspective, I find counterproductive. They are very low intensity in well-being and they are very high intensity in ecological footprint. So they are rather part of the problem, the solution. So now we need to ask ourselves, how do we change the way we teach, so that we stop creating, you know, the nice obedient little dentist of capitalism that just go out there and just manage to fix things and put a little tax when things is good and put a little greenwashing when a company needs it, and create true radical thinkers that, and that goes with the, the title of their talk, goes to the root of thing. So critical thinking and creativity. So that's what I would want to see.
Super, Timothée, thanks. Actually, you almost steal my last sentence, so I will try to close actually with Ronald here. We see that there are other questions in the chat. We will actually relay them to Timothée and we'll do our best to answer them, but it's almost the bottom of the hour, so we need to conclude. Timothée, thanks for being with us today, for answering our questions, for presenting your view on degrowth. Of course, we will share your contact and your upcoming book next year also with the participant of this conference. And you actually started it all, so you will always be the first in the Radical Thinker Conference series. I want also to, so thanks again, Timothée, and we will carry on with you on this topic of degrowth. I want also to highlight what comes next. It's a series of conferences. This was the first one from Timothée today. We'll do actually a second one the 3rd of March, same time, 3:30 p.m. And we'll invite actually Mr. Drenthe, which is actually a professor at Rambau University. And he will talk about the place of human among the livings. So I will leave you with that thought, the place of human among the livings. And again, radical conference series, we will get into the roots of things. So I wish you a very good end of the day, and we'll see you back on March the 3rd. Bye-bye.